It is my great pleasure to introduce this morning's plenary lecturer, Scott Weidensaul. Scott is a gifted naturalist with a passion for sharing what he knows with anyone within his earshot or who wants to read about the natural world around us. He has shared his knowledge of birds and natural history with hundreds of eager students of all ages at National Audubon's Hog Island Camp in Mid-Coast Maine's Muscongas Bay, where I've had the honor of teaching along with him. Scott is a prolific writer on birds and natural history. His books include Return to Wild America, a year-long search for the continent's natural soul, and The Ghosts with Trembling Wings, Science, Wishful Thinking, and the Search for Lost Species. He was a finalist for the 2000 Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction for his book Living on the Wind, Across the Hemisphere with Migratory Birds. And most recently, in 2021, he published A World on the Wing, The Global Odyssey of Migratory Birds. A Los Angeles Times book review stated that Scott Weidensaul ranks among an elite group of writer-naturalists. Bruce Chatwin, John McPhee, and David Quammen come to mind, whose straightforward eloquence elevates ecology to the level of philosophy. I think putting Scott in the class of writer-naturalists doesn't do him justice. Quammen, Chatwin, and McPhee eloquently describe and make accessible the work of groundbreaking scientists. Scott is in a very elite group of scientists who have the gift of making their own research accessible to the lay audience. I think Scott is a rare blend of David Quammen and Jared Diamond. As we'll learn, as soon as I stop rambling, the work of Scott and his team of snowy owl researchers is rivetingly fascinating and great science. So let me hand the podium over to my good friend, Scott Weidensaul.
So how's the audio sound right now? Okay. If I get too excited and I get too loud, just kind of gesture and I'll back off a little bit because I'm snowy owls. I get excited. And I'm delighted to be here. I realize this is Raptor Research Foundation's second post-pandemic conference. This is my first post-pandemic conference of any sort. And to be in a large room with people I know and respect, I am equal parts excited and slightly freaked out. So, but it's wonderful. So many old friends that I have not seen in a long time. People to whom I owe part of what I do. But I want to talk about snowy owls today. And I want to talk about Project Snowstorm, which started 10 years ago. And it started because of a really an historic event. This is as you all recognize, an eBird map of a typical winter's distribution of snowy owls in the Northeast, Southern Canada, and the Great Lakes region. This was January 2013, a couple hundred birds scattered around the Great Lakes, scattered along the Ottawa and St. Lawrence River valleys, and along the coast of New England. That's what it looked like in December of 2013, which was not a typical year. This was the largest eruption of snowy owls into the east since at least the winter of 1926-27, and possibly as far back as the 1890s. And the reason for this was not because these birds were starving to death and chased south by hunger and they're all going to wander the southern landscape until they die of starvation. I mean, almost everything that was in the press that year about snowy owls was wrong. The reason there were so many snowy owls is because the previous summer, in June of 2013, there was an historic peak in lemming populations in northern Quebec in the Ungava Peninsula. And snowy owls gathered there in large numbers and just started popping out babies like gumballs out of a gumball machine. I'm like, take a look at this nest. There's 4 or 5 eggs in that nest, surrounded by, and feel free to count them, 78 dead lemmings and voles. The babies haven't even hatched yet, and this male is going to town. But of course, what that is it's, I give this talk to general audiences, and the women all go like, "Oh God, yeah, man, what are you going to do?" But this is the male's way of telling the female, "Don't stop at 5, baby, keep them coming." And many nests in the Ungava that summer had 6, 7, 8, 9 chicks, most of which survived to fledging. And come autumn, all of those birds started heading south. And we got our first taste of what was coming in late November of 2013, when Bruce McTavish, one of the deans of ornithology and birding in Newfoundland, posted this blog post about 300 snowy owls in a fairly small restricted area at the southeastern edge of Newfoundland near Cape Race. And by early December, these birds were pouring across the Canadian border into the northern United States. Some of them made it as far south as Jacksonville, Florida. One of them wound up in Bermuda. There was this flood of white birds coming south out of the Arctic. And I got a call on December 7th, 2013, from my good friend Dave Brinker. Many of you know Dave, biologist with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. I've been working with Dave on saw-whets and other owl stuff for 20-some years. Dave called me up and said, look, none of us are going to live long enough to see something like this happen again. We need to drop everything else we're doing and try to make the most that we can, get as much information, get as much data out of this phenomenon as we can. We're thinking like, encourage banders to trap more snowy owls, because there's really relatively few snowy owls that have been banded. But by the afternoon of that day, I got a call from my old friend Andy McGann, who at the time was working for Mike Lanzone at Cellular Tracking Technologies, who said, hey, we've got a couple of transmitters here that we built for somebody else, but they don't need them right away. And if you can just cover our costs, we would love to get some transmitters on snowy owls. Except we didn't have any money. We didn't have a project. So I made a couple of phone calls to a couple of people who have been private supporters of some of the solid owl work we've done over the last decade or two. And they ponied up enough money for us to buy 6 of CTT's GPS GSM transmitters. And so Dave and I contacted my good friend Norman Smith at Massachusetts Audubon, who's been working with snowy owls at Logan Airport in Boston for more than 40 years. We talked to JF at Hawk Mountain. We talked to a couple of other people, and we submitted a proposal to the Bird Banding Lab requesting permission to put GPS GSM transmitters on snowy owls in the east. We had approval from the Banding Lab in less than 2 hours, because as it turned, don't let anybody tell you the government can't move with alacrity when they're ready to. They'd been thinking, they frankly were already thinking along the same lines and kind of hoping somebody would come up with this idea. And so Project Snowstorm was born. And about 2 weeks later, we were down on the coast of Maryland on Assateague Island, trying to trap the first of our snowy owls that we're going to put transmitter on. It's Mike Lanzone with our first hatch-year male, a bird that we nicknamed Assateague. All of our Project Snowstorm birds are nicknamed for the locations where they are trapped. A couple of weeks later, we tagged our second snowy owl in the Buena Vista grasslands in central Wisconsin, and we were off to the races. And this was a year when snowy owls were all over the news. They were everywhere and people were paying attention. And so they were in the news not always for the best of reasons. For example, the Port Authority in New York decided that snowy owls were a hazard to navigation at JFK and LaGuardia airports, and they started shooting them. Pro tip, don't shoot Hedwig. You will get millions of angry Harry Potter fans like storming the ramparts with torches and pitchforks. In fact, we recognized that snowy owls, because they're attracted to airports, we had an opportunity to build on the work that Norman had been doing and others have been doing over the years at Logan Airport, to use telemetry to find out if there are better ways to understand how snowy owls react after being relocated from airports, because people like Norman have been spending years trapping and transferring birds away from airports. Some airports, like for example, Philadelphia, where Jenny Martin worked with the USDA Wildlife Services, were putting a lot of time and effort into trapping snowy owls and moving them rather than shooting them. And many of these owls come back. So we thought if we can start to use telemetry to figure out what's going on here, we can come up with some best management practices to minimize the risk to these birds. And so that was the first snowy owl that we caught at the Philadelphia airport. We also worked at BWI and some other airports in the Baltimore area. With the Pennsylvania Game Commission, we moved that owl 50 miles west into the farmland of Lancaster County, deep in Amish country, where there were lots and lots of other snowy owls, and the little bugger turned around and went right back to the airport. And we spent the next couple of weeks trying to retrap him, and we were not able to. And one morning at daybreak, he flew across an active runway as a cargo jet was taking off and was struck and killed. I will say, didn't destroy, it destroyed, but did not stop the transmitter from working. Kudos to CTT for that one. So we salvaged the carcass, And we turned to our veterinary team. Early on in Project Snowstorm, we founded a team headed up there by Dr. Cindy Driscoll on the left, who's the state wildlife biologist for Maryland Department of Natural Resources, along with Cheryl Davison in the middle from University of Pennsylvania's Bolton Center in southeastern Pennsylvania, and Dr. Erica Miller, who at the time was working with Tri-State Bird Rescue and is now with University of Pennsylvania's Wildlife Futures Program. We realized we had an opportunity. If we started working with state and provincial and federal agencies and rehabbers to salvage snowy owls that were accidentally killed, that we could learn a lot more about the health and toxicology and parasitology of snowy owls, about which very little has been known. And so now with Dr. Ellen Bronson at the Maryland Zoo, this team has necropsied more than 200 snowy owls have been salvaged over the last 10 years. And working with collaborators in other parts of the US and Canada, we have a database now with more than 400 snowy owls in it, by far the largest database in the world on snowy owl health. So in January 2014, and we're still just a couple of weeks into this, we launched Project Snowstorm as an entity. We have a website. We were encouraging people, if they could take good, clear photographs, geotagged photographs, showing the spread wings and tail of a snowy owl from the dorsal surface, we'd be able to age and sex that owl and start to look at age and sex class distributions across the eruption area. We were moving pretty fast doing this, and we weren't always thinking things through well in advance. And so we ended up getting contacted by the folks at eBird, who said, hey, if you're doing this, we should have a way to fold that information into eBird. And we said, yes, absolutely. That's on our list. That's on our to-do list. And we made that happen. We were on a conference call. This was pre-Zoom, so it was just a bunch of disembodied voices on the phone, and somebody up at eBird in Ithaca said, well, okay, that's great, but the next time you're doing something like this, we'd appreciate it if you could bring us into the planning process a little bit earlier. I said, there is no planning process. We're making this up as we go. And one of the things we were making up was how the hell we were going to pay for this. We weren't writing grants months or years in advance and hitting up foundations. We had enough money from these 2 donors to buy 6 transmitters. And then Dave Brinker, again, who's a good guy with new ideas, said, we should crowdfund this. We should launch a crowdfunding campaign. And I said, let me get this straight. You want us to ask strangers to give us money to play with owls? Because that's what it's going to sound like. And he said, yeah, we should do that. And so we did. We launched a $20,000 campaign on the platform Indiegogo and blew right past that in no time at all. And because we're partnering with the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in Central Pennsylvania, which is the institutional home of Project Snowstorm, all of those donations coming in from US citizens were fully tax deductible. So that first winter, we raised $36,000 in small donations from around the world, and a roughly equal amount of money that came in from ornithological clubs, birding organizations, a few state agencies, often to sponsor transmitters to go on owls in their states. And so that winter, we were able to tag 22 snowy owls in 7 states. And I got to tell you, it was a wild ride. In fact, toward the end of the winter, my wife kept saying, you realize you're not getting paid for any of this? And I said, yes, but it's too much fun, and I can't stop now. Eventually she said, it's time for these owls to go home. You need to have a life again. And at the end of the winter, we sat down at Hawk Mountain in April of 2014 to talk about what we wanted to do next. Was this going to be a one-off? Was Project Snowstorm just a flash in the pan for this one historic winter with this extraordinary eruption, or should we continue this? And if so, in what capacity? So we talked through a lot of options. One of the things we discussed was whether we should expand Project Snowstorm's reach to include other Arctic nesting raptors like rough-legged hawks and short-eared owls, gyrfalcons. Gyrfalcons would be cool to work with, but at the end of the day, we decided no, we just want to keep our focus on snowy owls, and let's see how far we can take this. And it may be that public interest is going to die off. We won't be able to sustain this, but let's keep it going. Well, that was 10 years ago. And I have to say, it's been going rather well. In the years since then, we have now tagged more than 110 snowy owls in 17 states and provinces, primarily from the Upper Great Plains, North Dakota, east through New England, southern Canada, down into the mid-Atlantic region, although we've done a little bit of work elsewhere. We also are, as I said, collecting blood and tissue and feather samples from live snowy owls that we're catching, even the ones that we're not putting transmitters on, so we can do isotopic and genetic and toxicology analysis. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we have this really terrific team of veterinarians that are continuing to push the boundaries on what we know about snowy owl health. And we have a core team of about 24 people, many of whom are sitting in this room. From the end of November, early December through April or May, depending on when the owls finally head back north again on their spring migration. We meet by Zoom every week. It is an entirely collaborative operation. Dave Brinker and I more or less are the primary cat herders here, but there's no executive director of Project Snowstorm. And everybody involved in Project Snowstorm is doing this as a volunteer. Nobody gets any kind of a salary, nobody gets any kind of a stipend. All the money that we raise for Project Snowstorm goes into the field in the form of transmitters, into the lab, or we reimburse the folks who do our banding for their travel and gas and food expenses. It's been a learning experience, as Mike and Trish and some of the other folks working on this and JF can tell you. Early on, we thought, okay, even though this notion that snowy owls are primarily diurnal is not true in the wintertime, they're primarily nocturnal in the winter, but they roost out in the open. So this is an ideal opportunity to use solar powered transmitters, except that an awful lot of snowy owls habitually sit facing the sun. They're like little sunflowers. As the sun moves across the sky, they keep turning, so their back is in shadow. And they've also, they're snowy owls, they got really deep, thick plumage. And so, we've had to experiment with transmitter designs to keep the solar panel up high enough above the feathers. But we've kind of got it dialed in now, and it's worked really, really well. We're absolutely indebted to the folks that actually do the hard work of trapping and banding these snowy owls. We've been working, as I said, with people like Norman Smith in Massachusetts, who's been trapping snowy owls longer than almost anyone else in North America. One of the early collaborators on Project Snowstorm is Tom McDonald here from upstate New York, who's spent about the last 30 years trapping and studying snowy owls in upstate New York. Unfortunately, Tom's health now precludes him from being active out in the field, but he has trained up a really terrific replacement, a woman named Melissa Nance-Caniglio in upstate New York. We have Matt Selensky with the Northern Prairie Research Center in North Dakota, Charlotte England and Malcolm Wilson in Southern Ontario. These are the folks who were out there freezing their buns off, catching these birds. And again, they're doing it for nothing except reimbursement for their gas and their hotel lodging. So Project Snowstorm is an entirely public funded entity. And so keeping our supporters engaged with the project has been absolutely central to what we've been doing. Not surprisingly, our website, our webpage is the portal through which most people come to and remain connected with Project Snowstorm. Two of the most important tools that we have for engaging them are regular blog posts. We update our blog at least weekly during the winter season. New owls that we're trapping and tagging other owls. Every year, in an average year, we get 9 to 10 of our previously tagged owls that come back south again. They make a huge data dump when they come back within cell range in November or December. That's always super exciting. And then we also have interactive maps for all of these owls on our website, all 110 or so owls that we've tagged. And you can look up any of the owls we've worked with. Some of these were one-hit wonders. We've had owls that we've put transmitters on that 3 days later got hit by a car or knocked completely to pieces by the jet wash of an airplane at an airport because they flew back to the airport. But we also have updated bios on all of the owls on there. So we try to create these interactive maps. Now, when we started, we had no way of having any kind of interactivity on the map. When we first launched this in 2013, 2014, the best we could do was take screenshots of static maps using Google Earth, which is how we get most of our data, these KML files that come in. And then I got an email one day from a guy named Don Crockett in Massachusetts, who is a software developer with a passion for owls. And he had created kind of a proprietary software, a mapping software that he was willing to share with us gratis so that we could create these interactive maps so people could see where these owls were moving on kind of a week-to-week basis, with some cool features, like, for example, showing locations and activity in daytime in red and activity and locations at night in blue. So you can see they are primarily nocturnal at that time of the year. Unfortunately, we lost Don in 2017. He died unexpectedly, tragically. And because this was proprietary software on his computer, we had no way of maintaining those maps. And so at that point, we shifted over to an ArcGIS mapping software that CTT has. We run these maps through CTT software, and they're great. You can zoom in, you can see where the owl's gone at, across multiple years. You can zoom in at local scale. Each of the icons is clickable. They're also color coded to show, daylight, darkness, twilight. People can see, flight speed, altitude, latitude, and longitude, all sorts of great stuff there. But one thing we won't tell you is where the owl is right now. We want to make sure we give the owls plenty of space. So generally the maps update about 3 times a week, and they're all time delayed by about 24 hours. So the most recent data you're going to get is about 24 hours old. Every time we post a new blog post, that goes out to, gets pushed out to about 3,200 email subscribers. And every year we run a new crowdfunding campaign. And they've been extremely successful. We have developed a really very loyal, supportive cadre of supporters, some of whom I will say are in this room. You know who you are. And we couldn't do it without them. Now, I also recognize, everybody on Project Snowstorms recognizes we are working with one of the most insanely charismatic species on the planet. My apologies to everybody who's tried to do crowdfunding for vultures. It's kind of embarrassingly easy to raise money with snowy owls. Although I will tell you, our fundraising success rises and falls with the degree to which there is an eruption that year in the east. Because when there's an eruption, snowy owls are in the news. We get calls from media. Project Snowstorm is out there a lot. We get a lot of kind of over the transom donations coming in. In a year like last year, when there were very few snowy owls, the numbers are much lower. But we're really careful with the money that we raise. We've been able to husband some of that against rainy days, and so we've been even in an off year like last year, we're still okay. So with the exception of a very modest overhead fee that the Ned Smith Center charges us for handling all of our finances, which is, I think they charge us 15%. It might not even be that high. As I said, all the other money goes into the field, into the lab. We're reimbursing people. No one at Snowstorm takes any kind of a salary. We recognize this is not a model that a lot of research programs are going to be able to follow. Everybody working on Snowstorms either doing this because they've got some free time, or in some cases are able to do it through their employer if they're working for a state agency, if they're working for a nonprofit. So at this point, and what you're looking at here is an aggregate map showing all of the movements of all of our owls through the end of last year. So we're looking at something like 700,000 GPS locations. This is either the biggest or one of the biggest movement data sets for snowy owls in the world. I'm not aware of another aggregate data set for snowy owls that's this big, but I'm a little nervous about standing up in front of a lot of people and saying we're number one. But we're getting pretty close. We've been working with other colleagues in Canadian prairies and elsewhere who've also been doing a lot of tagging work. Again, this comes back to this collaborative approach that we have taken from the get-go. And speaking of collaboration, we're also an active part of the International Snowy Owl Working Group, which has a meeting on Sunday up in La Crosse, Wisconsin at the World Owl Conference. I'm going to be skipping out of here early to get up there for that. We from the very beginning, we had had made it a goal that we were going to make sure that we weren't just accumulating data that we were getting this published as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so over the years and with increasing frequency in the last couple of years, we've been publishing in peer-reviewed journals. We're up to about a dozen or so papers, a couple of really exciting ones that are in the pipeline right now. For example, we are underwriting an analysis of that huge snowy owl health and toxicology data set that we have, working with Dr. Nicholas Lecompte at Moncton University in New Brunswick, and analyzing this 400 plus owl data set. I'll share just a couple of results with that from that with you. That we haven't submitted this for publication yet. It's still in process, but the preliminary results interestingly show a male bias in mortality. I won't comment on that. I'm a guy, that seems to make sense to me. And also surprising east-west gradient in both age, sex class structure, and causes of mortality. For example, if you look here, the percentage of immature owls of both sexes that were found dead range from about 64% in the Northeast to just about 38% in British Columbia, and roughly equal amounts in the Great Lakes and Northern Great Plains. Now, part of the reason for that may be because there's, in the period that we're looking from about 2008 on, there's only been one major eruption in the Pacific Northwest. And we know that a lot of these large eruptions are dominated by hatchier birds. So there just may not have been as many hatchier birds coming into the Pacific Northwest into that data set. In fact, most of the owls that we're including from that area are coming out of British Columbia. If you look at cause of death, it's a little bit more striking. In aggregate, trauma is by far the most common cause of death among snowy owls when they come south, counts for about 49% of all mortalities. But there are sharp regional differences here as well. For example, in the Northeast, trauma and disease together constitute about 3/4 of all the causes of death, all the mortality, while starvation was a little bit less than 1/4. Disease was less common of cause of death in central and the northwestern regions, but starvation was much, much higher as a cause of death. There were about 43% in the central region and 59% in British Columbia. Again, often these birds that are coming south in a big eruption year, these young birds, are in really good physical condition because they're the result of a really bountiful breeding season up in the Arctic. And so in off years, the birds may tend to be in less good physical condition because it just was less food. That's the reason why they didn't breed that year. Poisoning is actually a very rare cause of death in snowy owls. Only one out of about 350 or so that were tested. I want to make sure I get my numbers right here, so I'm looking down at my notes. We found anticoagulants, rodenticide, at trace levels in almost every owl that we tested. They were at quantifiable levels in about 28% of the owls that we tested. Lead levels in liver were fairly low, as opposed to, for example, bald eagles, and we know what a problem lead is in eagles. But methylmercury was present at detectable levels in about 58% of the owls that we tested. And in 30%, the levels were high enough that it potentially could interfere with reproduction. It looks like methylmercury is a significant problem with snowy owls. One of the things we'd like to do is start to tease out whether snowy owls that are hunting in marine areas where they're feeding on water birds may be picking up methylmercury at lower levels than those that are feeding on water birds in freshwater environments where we know methylmercury levels tend to be a bit higher. But we're not there yet. I mentioned before snowy owls because they have this attraction to airports. That's been a focus of ours from the very beginning, and this is something that Becca McCabe was working on for her PhD. And so I'm going to share a little bit from a paper that Becca and we published in 2022, looking at 42 tagged snowy owls that were relocated from 13 airports in the US and Canada, looking at relocation distance, the habitat into which the birds were relocated, to see if there were any lessons here that airport authorities could use on how to move snowy owls into places so they don't come back. And not surprisingly, the farther you move a snowy owl away from an airport, the less likely it is to come back. Now, that seems like that would be common sense. The problem is a lot of these airports and agencies are restricted in how far they can take these owls. In fact, in many cases, they can't move them outside of the state or province in which they've been trapped. I live in New Hampshire. Snowy owl habitat in New Hampshire is the coastline. The coastline is 22 kilometers long. How do you move a snowy owl far enough away from the airport that it's not doesn't beat you back to the airport? On the other hand, if you look at the habitat into which the owls are moved, there may be a solution here. The owls are far less likely to return from a relocation into a wetland habitat as opposed to a cropland habitat. When you think about it, in the winter, it all kind of looks the same to us, but under the snow, if it's a plowed field, there's probably not a whole lot in the way of mammalian prey there. On the other hand, pastures and wetlands and natural grasslands probably hold high numbers or potentially hold high numbers of small mammal prey. So looking, thinking hard about the kind of habitat in which these owls are being moved may help prevent them from coming back. Project Snowstorm is underwriting that analysis that I just mentioned on health and toxicology. We also provided significant funding for the first global status assessment and population trend, which Becca McCabe's got her fingerprints all over Project Snowstorm, as you can tell, that she's just completed and that's been submitted for publication. And with Becca's permission, I'm going to share a little bit of that with you right now. By pooling data from international snowy owl working group partners around the world, we were able to map the current extent of snowy owl breeding with recent breeding results from 7 long-term studies in the Pan-Arctic region. And we also pulled telemetry data from a lot of our partners to look at the broad outlines of regional migration flyways. This is the first time that this has been mapped out for snowy owls. Becca's analysis also supports recent estimates that the global snowy owl population is somewhere between 14,000 and 28,000 adult snowy owls. You may have heard that snowy owl populations declined by 64%. The way we estimated snowy owl populations that didn't used to take into account that these birds are moving thousands of kilometers between breeding seasons, and we were hence over counting snowy owls, double or triple counting them, wasn't taking that into account. The most surprising and I have to say heartwarming result of this is that for the moment, at least, snowy owl populations appear to be stable. Although Becca did find that 5 out of the last 10 years, there were negative growth rates. So it's obviously something we're going to have to keep a very careful, close eye on. Although our prime interest is in winter movement ecology of snowy owls, these transmitters track them when they go up to the breeding grounds, and when they come back in cell range, we get all of that data. And so we end up with an exceptionally detailed database on the year-round movements of snowy owls. And when you look at, the granularity of the summer data is really kind of astonishing. This is not something that we've really done any kind of comprehensive analysis of, but this is another, I think, really rich treasure trove for us to start to mine down the road for publication. There's some other avenues that we'd like to pursue. We'd like to work with our veterinary team. They're very interested in knowing how well rehabilitated snowy owls do when they're returned to the wild. This is something that rehabbers, I think, across the board would like to have more information on. We're working with Dr. Guy Fitzgerald in Quebec. Guy is a noted raptor rehabilitator up there and already has the permits from the Canadian side to start tagging rehabilitated snowy owls this winter. Obviously, being careful and choosy about what snowy owls we're putting a transmitter on. But interested in finding out more of what's going on there. We'd like to start doing the same thing on the US side, and we've reached out to the bird banding lab to start conversations about that as well. Listen, I want to wrap things up here so we have some time for questions, but I'm really, just for fun, I want to leave you with 2 of the more head-scratching tracks that we've gotten from snowy owls over the years. Sometimes we get these data and we look at them and we go, huh? Because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this is a bird that was tagged in Erie, Pennsylvania in January of 2014. This is a bird that Mike Lanzone and Tom McDonald tagged. And that winter, that was the polar vortex winter when like Lake Erie was 98.5% frozen. And so what you're seeing here, all of those square icons represent a stationary owl, and they're at 30-minute intervals. And when you get those long strings of little icons, it's moving at about a quarter of a mile an hour. I looked at this and I thought, oh my God, he's walking to Canada. And I'll admit, it took a couple of days to figure out that, no, this is what happens when you have a stationary owl sitting on a gigantic plate of ice that's getting very slowly pushed by prevailing winds. And then that same owl flew north up to and out onto Hudson Bay, where he did that. Now, you kids won't know what I'm talking about, but us old people remember something called a spirograph. That was, that would make these weird doodly kind of, that's it, like somebody gave him a spirograph. And again, it took a day or two to figure out, no, this is what happens when you have a snowy owl that is riding on an iceberg out in Hudson Bay. And I don't have a pointer here. Oh, I guess actually, hold on, maybe I do. Let's look at that. So I'm just going to be able to do this one, but what you see here is when the tide and the wind are going in the same direction, it goes a long way, and then the wind turns against the tide, and then the tide and the wind, and then the wind goes out of the south and out of the west, and the owl says, screw that, and goes back to land. This has been such an enjoyable, exciting, rewarding project. I don't think I've ever done anything in my life that has kept me up at night quite as much as this one, but also given me such a deep sense of satisfaction. And, you know, if you'd like to come along for the ride, project www.projectsnowstorm.org. We'd love to have you. Keep an eye on what we're doing, keep us honest, give us suggestions, give us ideas. I will sum this up by saying that this completely accidental, utterly unplanned, and thoroughly organic project has been a delight. And I'm honored to have been asked to share this with you today. Thank you all so much. It's just been a real pleasure.
So we have time for questions.
Okay, asking Jim Bednarz to ask the first question scares the hell out of me. So to summarize Jim's question, he was noting the fact that in many parts of the Arctic, lemming cycles have changed. In some cases, lemmings have stopped cycling. In other cases, the cycles are becoming less frequent. The frequency is stretching out. And what the concern that poses for snowy owls. Yeah, I mean, in parts of Arctic Scandinavia, lemmings have largely stopped cycling, and snowy owls have stopped breeding there. In some parts of eastern Russia, like Wrangel Island, the cyclicity has gone from about 4 years to more like 6 to 8 years, and so the owls are breeding less often and probably less successfully. There's also some indication that conditions in parts of the eastern and central Canadian Arctic may be getting better for lemmings because of climate change, that part of the Arctic, late winter and early spring, has actually gotten colder and snowier. And so you've got better conditions for lemmings because lemmings start breeding in that subnivean environment under the snow during the winter. And as Jim said, when there's ice crust and winter melt and winter warmth, that's so. I am not taking that stability that Becca found in global snowy owl populations for granted, because I would argue that snowy owls are, with ivory gulls, polar bears, and walruses, the species at most immediate and direct risk from climate change. Other questions? I'm glad you asked that. Are there concerns about the impact of highly pathogenic avian influenza on snowy owls? Oh God, yes. I mentioned that most years, 9 or 10 of our previously tagged owls come back. Last year, 3 came back. And we assume that we lost many of our tagged birds. Late in the season, we had a bunch of birds that just kind of flipped out before they migrated north. We weren't able to salvage those carcasses. We weren't able to recover those carcasses, so we don't know. But we assume that HPAI was the reason. We know that snowy owls have been hit hard. They're feeding on water birds, on ducks and gulls and species that are known vectors for HPAI. So yeah, we're very concerned about that. So again, taking with a grain of salt and some considerable caution this notion that snowy owl populations are stable. I think that isn't, so the question is, to repeat for the folks online. We know that these big eruptions are driven primarily by productivity. But Jeff was saying he's always assumed that in off years, it may be hunger that's driving these birds south. That certainly can happen. In some years, you'll get an influx of birds that are in very poor physical condition. I don't want to say that doesn't happen, but one of the things that we're finding with our tracking data is a lot of these adult snowy owls become regular, predictable migrants back south. I mean, we've had two birds whose transmitters failed that we were able to keep track of for several subsequent years because they kept coming back to the same farm in the Ottawa River Valley using the same trees. And one of them was a bird that we tagged initially we banded it as a juvenile the first year in Maryland. It came back the next year. We put a transmitter on it. It wintered the year after that on Amherst Island in Lake Ontario, and thereafter just zoomed in on this farm in the Ottawa River Valley year after year after year after year, which allowed us to finally, took a lot of repeated attempts, we were able to finally trap that bird and remove that failed transmitter. We didn't have permission from Ontario Ministry to put a new transmitter on, which was kind of frustrating, but at least we were able to take the old one off. So I think we've underestimated the degree to which adult snowy owls can be regular, reliable migrants. We've known that for a while from the Great Plains, especially the Canadian prairies, but it seems like that's much more the case elsewhere than we had appreciated before. Yes, Hannah. So the question is, do we see behavioral differences, like some birds that stay very tightly in one place for months at a time and until they migrate back north, or others that move? Yes, all of the above. And it doesn't seem to be connected to age or sex class. You know, we've had adult birds that have plunked themselves down. We have 2 adult females that we tagged on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I forgot to mention Chris Neary and Nova McKinley up in the UP at Whitefish Point, who've been doing trapping for us for years. I neglected to mention them before. These 2 females, the territories were about a quarter mile wide. They were next to each other. They never trespassed on each other. But if your neighbor weighs 6 pounds and has 8 needle sharp talons at the end of your feet, maybe you don't trespass. And then we've had other birds, adults that wandered widely, that have traveled for hundreds of miles through the Great Plains. I don't really understand why. And we've had birds like that bird that spent the winter out on Lake Erie one year. We thought, okay, so this is a bird that's going to come back down and hunt water birds out on lake, and it came down to Lake Ontario, looked around, went up and sat and spent the rest of the winter at the Toronto airport eating rabbits and mice. So surf one year, turf the next year. Where's JF? JF always says that snowy owls never read the rule book, and I think that's absolutely right. So, all right, we're almost done here. Time for another question, if there is one. If not, oh, I'm sorry. Yes. We would love to work out west. We haven't had a big eruption in the Northwest since we started Project Snowstorm. We don't at the moment have a vendor with whom we can work out there, although if there's anybody here who has experience and training and the permit, or willing to get a permit to do transmitter work in the Pacific Northwest, we would love to talk to you, because at some point it's going to happen again. Yeah, we would, it's just been opportunity at this point. Yeah. Oh, and I didn't repeat the question for the folks online. The question was, they noticed that all of the tracks were in the east. Were we interested in working in the Pacific Northwest, as you might have guessed from my answer. All right, I'm going to stop. I will talk about this stuff until your eyes roll back in your head, but I'm happy to do that to you one-on-one. Thank you all very much. It's been such a pleasure.